Mahito was actually the weakest cursed spirit. I'll wait for you to blow up at that. Are you done? Good. The statement still stands. But not for the reason that you think it does. Mahito is an ever-present factor within the first two seasons of Jujutsu Kaisen, and he plays a very important role. And it has been admitted by several characters in the story on both sides that he is one of the most powerful characters in there, and that's true. But he has a fatal limitation that actually ended up making him incredibly weak. So, let's talk about why he was actually the weakest cursed spirit. First, let me start off by saying that in terms of raw power and ability, Mahito was probably actually the strongest. It is a bit of a contention thing there because a lot of people like the fact that, Jogo had such a destructive curse technique, and Dagon arguably had the greatest, spawning style technique. But of, the vast majority, most people would agree that Mahito had the most potential. It's even said by Hanami upon Jogo's death that Mahito had the greatest potential of all the cursed spirits. So that's why they made him the leader. He had the greatest ability to transcend their limitations and become the most powerful. And no small part of that was due to his curse technique, Idle Transfiguration. Idle Transfiguration essentially allowed Mahito to modify the soul of any living thing. Now, we know that didn't apply to objects, but we do know that it seemed to apply to everything from humans to himself. I would therefore assume that cursed spirits were also modifiable by this curse technique because, he himself being a curse technique. So, a curse. So, with that in mind, how can I say that he's the weakest? Well, it's actually because of his curse technique. Mahito had boundless cursed energy, probably the most creativity of any of the disaster curses, definitely putting him up on the top there. The problem becomes that his technique was so wide open, his personality actually became its biggest limitation. Allow me to explain. Idle Transfiguration's ability to warp things could be used in a variety of ways. He could reshape his own body into weapons, into defensive material. He could turn into animals for evasion or attack. He could, blend in with different people, if anybody could see him at all, given that he was, in fact, a cursed spirit. That extreme flexibility in oneself is a terrifying factor, made even more terrifying by the fact that he could do this with others, kind of. He could warp other people by making contact with them. Now, usually he used this to try and inflict death or severe injury, but if a sorcerer was strong enough, they could attempt to protect their soul with cursed energy. This wasn't unlimited, though, and it was implied that if he hit a strong enough sorcerer enough times, he would probably be able to warp them. Another factor of this is that when he didn't feel like killing somebody, he would actually transfigure a human into, obviously transfigured human, and create, basically a small army of mindless minions to follow his orders. But that's not really all his curse technique could do, and it's not even the most interesting thing his curse technique could do with other people. Because it's kind of interesting to think about the fact that the soul and the body are so intertwined in Jujutsu Kaisen that for Mahito, he could heal people. He could, heal people from the most severe injuries. He could heal them from a heavenly pact, something that is so far beyond the realm of most Jujutsu sorcerers, they can't even begin to comprehend what it is. And yet, he can circumvent it. And not only circumvent it, he can circumvent it in such a way that the recipient of the pact gets to keep all of their abilities from it. That's what he did with Mekamaru. That is such a significant thing. I mean, he just bypasses everything about Jujutsu in that fashion. And on that same note, he's able to grant people Jujutsu abilities. The most we see with this is, Junpei is probably the best example because it's the one we see the most of. But he can modify a person's brain that allows them to then see cursed spirits and access cursed energy. He can also actually give impressions into their mind so they don't have to take as long with training how to use their curse techniques. Given that Mahito was already a pretty creative explorer of his own curse technique, that would actually probably be a big boost. Now, as we discuss that, you have to keep in mind that later with the culling games and stuff, that's done en masse. That's done to dozens, if not hundreds of people, and granting them superhuman abilities because they essentially awaken their own embedded curse techniques. But take that one step farther. Mahito could probably change somebody's curse technique. We have no reason to think that because he can warp the body and curse techniques are engraved on the body, that he wouldn't necessarily not be able to change a curse technique or even possibly bestow one onto somebody that didn't have one to begin with. Yeah, that's one of those funny things they don't talk about, but he didn't really have enough time with it, nor the inclination to help people in this way, but he definitely could have. There's also this interesting implication that the people that he usually affects in this way, awakening their abilities, were people that were born with the ability to perceive curses and cursed energy, at least on their periphery. They just weren't born as sorcerers. Whether that makes them kind of like windows that work for Jujutsu High or not is not fully explained. But what it does mean is that essentially there's no reason to think that he could not take an average person and modify them into a sorcerer. I'm not saying they'd be a powerful sorcerer. They probably wouldn't be. After all, when we look at how he transfigures regular humans, there is limits to what he can do to the body. So I would assume that he could probably give somebody the ability to perceive cursed energy and curses. He could probably even give them the ability to utilize their own. I might even go out on a limb and say he might give them a curse technique. But I think in the vast majority of people, even if he did that, it would be kind of like Mai Zenin. They'd have very weak cursed energy unless they built heavily upon it, and they would probably have a very hard time using their curse technique except in very specific circumstances. That having been said, these are only a few of the things that we know he could do. This power was probably the strongest in the series, and had it been given to a main character or anyone else, it would have been fascinating to see what could have been done with that. And in retrospect with that, Mahito's anger, his desire, his psychotic desire to toy with people, everything that makes him a villain limits him. It limits him to the opportunities of what the true power of his curse technique is. And because of that, he is a weak curse spirit. In that way, he's the weakest curse spirit because unlike Jogo and unlike the others, he could not embrace the true essence of his curse technique. He was born to represent, the fear and hatred that humanity has for itself. But in that same note, because he embraces the worst aspect, he misses everything else that a human could be.